Hello, today on our podcast, Just Us, we're going to wrestle with the subject of white privilege. Is it real? Is it a myth? What is it?
And you could find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and if you like to just watch us personally, you can see us on YouTube. So subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, give us a review, and thank you for tuning in.
And we hope you enjoy this episode where we make room for you in our hearts.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Just Us, a podcast about racial reconciliation and justice. And today we're going to tackle the subject of white privilege. Is it real? Is it imagined? What is it? When President Obama was elected as president in our country, I heard from many people that racial issues are done. We're past that. In fact, Barna did a survey recently. 34% of white Christians feel the country is beyond the fallout of slavery. In other words, that's in the history. It's a sad history, but we've moved on. But when you talk to many people about their real experiences in life, it oftentimes is different. So we're going to talk about the subject of white privilege. I know this is something controversial, but I think it's an important subject. First of all, I want to welcome Colette Newer with us. Colette Newer is the Director of Outreach Ministries at the Washington Conference, which includes community service and prison ministries. Colette, wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So we're going to start with the question, what is white privilege and what isn't it? Someone want to jump on that. What is white privilege and what isn't it?
Okay. I would say, so what I've heard is the facade of, just because I don't have white privilege due to the fact that I'm not rich. I wasn't born with a spoon. What is it? A golden spoon and stuff like what? Silver spoon. And okay, I understand that, but that doesn't mean just because you were born rich or whatever, you don't have a silver spoon in your mouth. That doesn't mean you don't have that privilege that could give you that silver spoon in your mouth easily, rather than other people. I'm not going to say working hard for it, but right, like not having the opportunity or having more opportunities than other people, basically. Let's just say that for the start.
Okay. Someone else.
I'll just add to that. I think that's a really good point. That it's laid out that there's fewer barriers.
Right.
I think there's fewer barriers for white people. It's not that there weren't barriers. I think most of us have had some barriers to overcome. But I also think that if you're white, you have more information about how to overcome the barriers. I think information is power, we've said in many forums, and I think that we restrict information and a couple ways that I think I've seen it played out. I think I'm just more comfortable in the dominant culture. As a white person, it is geared more towards my sensibilities. So it's just more comfortable to be functioning where I'm not having to interpret or adjust my own self. I understand it better, more innately. And I think one of the ways this has played out, especially this year, that I have seen is that white people define reality. That when we have heard black people or people of color, of any color, saying that I'm hurting or something's happening to me, that you see white people coming in over the top with a dialogue that says, no, that's not what's happening. This is what's happening.
Right.
And that's a privilege to be able to define the situation for somebody else. And that doesn't happen in the reverse, I don't think.
Mimi, what?
Yep.
There's a definition of white privilege, but what isn't it?
I don't believe white privilege. White privilege is not something that is. It's unearned. It's not something that is earned. You don't have to worry about your race because you belong to a majority group. So so it is not something that is it is unearned. Okay, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about economic value. There are very poor white people, just in any other ethnic group, who have had very difficult lives, but their skin color isn't one of those reasons, which gives gives white people advantages over other groups of people. So, yeah, so it is not necessarily about economics. Then you're moving into something like class or, your status, your wealth status. That's something different. That has its own privileges and advantages. But if you look at, some people say, well, white privilege doesn't exist because I didn't grow up wealthy. And wealth is not always a factor in white privilege.
That's the biggest response that I hear is people say, I don't believe in white privilege because I wasn't born wealthy. And so the word privilege seems to cause challenge sometimes because it makes people feel like, okay, I was born with a big trust fund and I had family connections that could get me into college, And so you're saying that's not white privilege. So what does white privilege for black people look like on a daily basis? What does white privilege look like?
That's broad. Well, I can start.
Give a couple of examples. In other words, we need to understand in a conceptual way we can visualize, but specifically, what does it look like? What is it like on a daily basis?
Well, for example, if you're going to look at, there's cultural, corporate in the workplace, there's religious regions, there's educational, healthcare, broad spectrum. But for example, going into the workplace, as a black woman, I've said it before here, when I go into that space, I look around to see who else looks like me. How many other people are there? Because there have been several times where I'm the only person, black person, or one of very few in the places I've worked. I have to consider, I have to worry about, well, what are they going to think about the way my hair looks? I don't have to walk into that and worry about my natural hair. Is somebody going to question that? They have before. The way I dress, the way I talk, the way I look. Is that going to be a factor in whether I get a job or how my job is affected? Who's uncomfortable if I disagree with something that is being said? Am I either the hysterical female or the angry black woman, or both? So those are some of the things that I believe the majority or the white people don't really have to consider their hair, their dress, when they walk out into society, in the workplace, for example.
Hans?
I would say, remember the episode of Code Switching that we had? If you haven't seen it, go and watch the Code Switching. Having the privilege not to be able to code switch is a white privilege. The fact that certain people of color had to code switch to feel like they're not threatening in a white space, or to get ahead, to change their dialect in order to get ahead, that's a sum of the privilege, because you don't have to do that, right? We are trying to appease to the oppressor to show that, hey, we're safe. And in history, if we look back, we should be the ones to be like, hey, are we actually safe from you due to the fact of history?
Correct.
But that's the thing with the whole white privilege thing. Like, you could just go and just talk. I can't be like I can't be like, you know what I mean? Like, I can't how I normally talk with my boys, my friends, it wouldn't work in a global workplace due to the power, or the power at hand, right? Those who are in power structures, correct. And it's a systematic thing. Like, I understand, like, you were given white privilege. It's not like, oh man, like, I don't know what white privilege. Yes, you just given the white privilege due to you being white, and is if we go back to history, you will see that. And that's one of the things. I'm like, I understand you might not know what that is because you were given into it. It isn't your choice due to what was placed systematically.
Is white privilege so much what whites have, or is it what blacks don't always have?
I think both. I mean, we don't, and I've said it before, we don't go and choose our skin. We don't put in an order, or our parents
Right.
or ancestors and say, blonde hair or black eyes, or, we don't choose the hue of our skin or anything like that. So it's not something that, we pull out of the closet and decide to put on the next day. We have it. This is how God created us, and that's what I think we need to look at. We cannot not see color. We have to see color because it's there in front of us and it's right here. For example, if, I know some people who English is their second language.
Right.
And they feel if they come into the workplace or wherever, they can't speak Spanish or French or Creole or whatever because people are going to think, well, what are they saying? And it puts on, are they talking about me? So it makes other people feel uncomfortable because they don't associate with that. And I have to make them sound like me, look like me, so I can be comfortable, rather than the other way. Well, what can I learn from this person who speaks another language? And in history, like I've read in some of my articles here, in Texas, some Hispanic kids were not allowed, the school would not allow them to come to school speaking Spanish. They couldn't speak Spanish in school because that was not the norm, the majority norm there. This is America, you speak English and that's it. And some of the kids who did speak Spanish, they were sent home.
It's interesting because you're talking about just being allowed to exist in a space and being allowed to participate, which still isn't talking about being allowed to contribute or being allowed to thrive there. So it's difficult enough to just be there when it's defined as something outside of yourself, where it needs to be opened up to allow you to actually be part of it.
Right.
And contribute.
There's a young man
that is
who
true.
I talked to yesterday, a young black man, Almonds. He was on a previous episode. And this is what he told me about white privilege. He said, whites can have struggles, but it is not because of the color of their skin.
Correct.
So it sounds like he's saying that there are things as a white person I don't have to think about that as my black brother and sister you have to think about. So one of the reasons I think people react defensively about white privilege is the idea that I'm inheriting the sins of my ancestors and that I am taking something away from you just by being. And based on what Almonds is saying, it doesn't sound like it's necessarily that. It's that as blacks, you have to deal with things that I don't have to think about. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I would say that's true. And we've touched on it before in this podcast where we've talked about, a black man driving a BMW down the street in a predominantly white neighborhood. What does that look like for him? Or, my brothers have been affected by the profiling in New York City, where, there's a black man, let's go stop him and see if there's anything on him. You don't have no cause to do that, but it's just happens. And white people don't have to worry about things like that. You don't have to walk down the street and worry about being, pulled over because you're white. And those are things that, black people do have to worry about. I've lectured my sons about wanting to go outside and just walk around. No, doesn't happen that way. So I think when it comes to because white people have privilege, there are advantages that they have or that they can take, that they can use, or that society has given them. Because of white privilege, they have advantages in society that others don't have.
Right.
And that goes back to historically looking the natives, of this country. The Chinese people who came here, the Japanese who were suffered through the internment during World War II. Black people, just for existing, because of the horrid historical fact of races of slavery,
Right.
which is still has effects today in our society. So I believe, the majority power structure has been set up for their advantage,
Correct.
and that therein is their
Correct.
privilege.
Correct.
Go ahead, Hans.
I was gonna, yeah, right. You was hitting on everything that I was gonna think about. That was in 1791, where what's the name of it? In 1791, they had the Article 4 was speaking about how people are property, right? So when slavery ended, white people lost property, and they were given reparation
For that loss.
for that loss. So white people had and back in the day, like 1790 something, it was like they were given over $1 million. Well, every white person was given $1 million for loss of property. So these are things, and as you were saying with the indigenous people, they had to leave. I think this 1854. They had to leave their land, right, to cross 15,000 miles of that,
Yeah.
to leave their land so white settlers could come and get and be in that land. And it was 25 million acres that they got, the white settlers. And with that journey, indigenous people lost 15,000 people with that. So it's like you were given it. Like even with Hitler, if we go back to Hitler, excuse me, Hitler was saying blonde hair, blue eyes. This is the purest. This is the purest. If you have blonde hair, blue eyes, you are the pure.
The Aryan race.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. So now it is still the same thing. Like when I was a kid, I only saw models on television, and what did they have? Blonde hair, blue eyes. So it still exists till this day. So, and even in courtrooms in 1854, I think California versus Hall, the Supreme Court. It was white people were barred in, right? White people were barred in, and not only that, blacks and Mulattoes and Indian people could not testify even for favor of a white man or against a white man. So when you go to court, it's like, why is certain if we have this, like, let's say I go to court and I did a crime, I stole candy, I will be sentenced, maybe I'm exaggerating, 5 years. If a white person does the same exact crime, they would have a lesser sentence or even be dismissed. What was the story with the guy that raped the girl, and the judge said, we don't want to ruin his life.
Oh,
so
the Brock Turner case.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, you see what I'm saying? That's
Yeah.
the privilege that you had. You didn't buy it. You were just given to it. And it is the Constitution and everything else that's within that. Like, if you rape a person, you're a monster. You're a rapist. You deserve what's coming to you. But nah, we don't want to ruin his life. Yeah. So here's like 6 months of probation, whatever he had to do, and he was off. That's the thing.
Now, something you had said, Hans, you talked about every white person. That would be every slave-owning white
yeah,
person.
yeah.
Because actually in the South, most of the people didn't own slaves. It was
Right.
a few,
That's what I meant. So yeah.
a few, just for
Those who
clarification.
lost property.
Right, just for clarification now. Now let me push back just for a little bit, just so we get deeper into it. 7 out of 10 suicides in America are white males. So when we talk about white privilege, we're not saying people have just this easy life. That's what I keep hearing and reading, is people saying, "Well, wait a minute, you're saying my life is easy. I'm privileged. I live in a uncomplicated." But that's not what we're saying.
Right. We're not
White
saying
people
that.
can have pain, they
Right.
can have difficulties, they can have poverty, they can have all kinds of issues.
Well, just like everybody else.
So
You know?
so I think we need to be a little bit specific. One of my pastor friends who is on our podcast, I think it was last episode, Randy Maxwell. He explained white privilege and what to me connected dots in my mind. He said, when I get on an elevator as a black male with a white woman, he said, immediately I make myself very small and I don't move a muscle.
Right. Yep.
Because in his mind, with the history, he has to feel very vulnerable in that situation. What if someone accused him of something? Whereas when I, as a white male, when I get on the elevator, I'll say good morning and I'll, in other words, that's an example. And he mentioned people seeing him coming, and he is about the most gentlemanly person that you could ever know. But he's seen people cross the street to be away from him.
Correct.
And he's talked about going in stores and people following him around, worried that he's going to. What, on a daily basis, because we talk about white privilege as a concept, what are some specific examples from life that would illustrate what white privilege is?
Emmett Till. Emmett Till is the same
Yes.
exact thing with Randy. He has to make himself small. Why? Because he doesn't want to be accused, right?
Right.
Emmett Till, he was accused for whistling at a white woman, right?
Right.
And they brutally beat him, tortured him. It was, you could look at the story. And the mom had an open casket so they could she could show what these white people did to her son. And I think at the end of the white woman's deathbed, she goes, "He didn't do anything."
Right.
Right.
And
White privilege, right?
But let me just clarify. That was quite a few years ago. Bring it into today. What are examples? Because that's the whole premise. People are saying that was horrible.
Okay.
But we're past that. But what I'm hearing you say is we're not past it.
No.
So give me
No.
examples of ways in our day where we're not past it, where there are things that black people experience because of race that a white person has the privilege of not experiencing.
I believe a couple of good examples regarding in education. So recently, some very famous TV stars, I forget their names now, were convicted for paying,
Yeah.
someone or a school, a university, to take SATs.
Lori Loughlin.
Yes, thank you. And ACTs, or buy their children into a
Right.
prestigious university.
They faked sports
Correct.
things.
And whereas they got 2 months in a very low security prison of their
For mail
choice,
fraud.
for fraud. Whereas in a poorer county, a black woman had put down her aunt, I believe, or a relative's address for her son so he could be in a better school district, and she got 5 years in jail.
Really?
Those are headlines in the news in the past recent years. And so my question was, if I were to do something like that, I would definitely be in jail, that's a crime.
Correct.
Well, and you have people who are serving life terms for possession of
I
marijuana.
was just gonna go there.
And you have a celebrity who was in the last year, 2 years maybe, who posed for a social media photo with a closet stuffed full of marijuana. And people, there were no legal reaction to that.
Right.
It was you might not want to do that
Right.
type of reaction.
Yes.
Right, and then that one, I love that you said that because I was going to go to that. 1971, the war on drug, Nixon, with the whole marijuana thing, and then who else with the three strikes. So if you with marijuana, and now marijuana is legalized, right? But
In some states.
in some states, right? So with that being said, like you would not be penalized as a white person would not be penalized as a black person will, and that's the ironic thing about it. So
And now,
let me. I can just hear it in my mind because I've had a lot of discussions with people about this, and I've heard people push back and say that's an issue of class. That's not an issue of race. And let me explain what I mean by that. People with greater resources, a wealthier person, can get better lawyers. O.J. Simpson, for example.
okay.
In other words, sometimes people with lots of money can get really good lawyers. And so I'm not saying that there's not racial issues involved. What I'm saying is some of it perhaps is a class issue, where if people have more money,
But it's still a privilege and advantage, whether you're a rich white person versus a rich black person. You know, if I paid someone to get my kid into a prestigious university, you know, that would not look good on me. That happened in the news with the Lori Loeffler and the other lady, and it's gone. You know, so whether it's a class issue, it could be a combination of both, and I wouldn't say that's wrong at all. I think, but they went ahead and did it, and because they got caught, you know, they got to set the terms on, you know, I want to have a spa in my prison. And when I read the article about what their prison looked like, it was just shocking to me. Like, that's not a prison, that's just a rehab center. You know, right, for you to consider what you did wrong before we slap you on the wrist and let you off in 2 months.
Tell me about this. Probably the most painful example in my mind of white privilege is this one phrase: "You resemble a suspect." And I've heard from pastors that are colleagues of mine, that are amazing pastors, educated, you know, pulled over and detained, and the phrase is, you resemble a suspect. And that to me is, because that's never happened to me, and I've never heard any of my white pastor friends say they've experienced that. And I've got to think that would be very frustrating, and they would also be humiliating to experience. Let me ask something a little bit personal. When you hear people say, as my black brother and sister, when you hear people say there is no white privilege, what is that like for you?
What is that like for me?
Yeah.
Well, I have to decide. I have to caution my reactions to statements like that. And my sarcasm level to statements like that. So, and that's being honest.
Right.
You know, sometimes
We have to speak openly about this subject.
well, we do, because, for example, they're speaking from their reality and that statements like that and their lens.
Right.
When people say, "Oh, we're a post-racist society," no, we're not. Well, you guys had Obama, so that wiped it all away. No, it didn't.
Right.
Obama was obstructed in office from the Senate majority his whole 2 terms of the presidency, just because he was a black man, you know, and they did not want to have him get his bills and policies pushed through Congress. So, and that's clear. Mitch McConnell said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. My mission in life right now is to block everything that he submits to us, and that did come true. So if it were reversed, would that have happened?
Yeah, earlier you used the word horrid. And I think there's a horror on the side of white people to realize. Number one, we need to listen before we speak, and listen to somebody else defining their own reality and not correct you that you're wrong about your own experience. I mean, it's just, there's an arrogance to that that's just a little beyond the pale. But when you really hear it, and you hear the horror of what is happening, and you realize that you are a part of it, whether you like it or not, just by your existence, you are experiencing it, and just by my existence, I am a part of that, that we then tend to slip into denial. And we need to put ourselves aside a little bit and understand. I think we have problems with the guilt and the shame of that. But that is called being a Christian. That we, as Christians, understand that we are part of something very sinful, and that is in us, and we are of it, and we know that the world is imperfect. So to deny that of somebody else, is that this is an imperfect world and you are being hurt by that, I'm not sure that's biblical, and that is why we live under grace. That is why I have to accept grace every day, because I am doing something. I am not being stopped by the police. I am doing something that I am benefiting from this. I am wearing clothes that were made by somebody who probably was not paid very much.
Yep.
So I need to get comfortable with my own flaws and my own sinfulness to allow somebody else to be part of something, and to at least acknowledge this and to validate people. We're invalidating somebody's experience, and that is extremely hurtful.
Right.
And that's, yeah. And as a Christian, I don't think we have that example in Christ. When people say those things, you just want to say, put yourself in Christ's shoes for a minute and imagine saying that as Christ. And I can't imagine him saying that.
Yeah.
And the socioeconomic, because you
Yes.
know me. There are some aspects of that I think are intertwined. When you talk about redlining, that then makes a certain group of people in a lower socioeconomic. So it becomes easy to say, well, that's because of poverty, but who is in poverty? Who is there? Yes, it's not only them, but it's so disproportionate. And the laws, who's making the laws? Of course, we're gonna sympathize with ourselves. And so we make the laws that benefit, it doesn't even have to be that overt, but the economic structure is going to benefit some as opposed to others. Who gets paid? Who gets which jobs, and who gets paid more? Daycare workers have lives in their hands, but they do not get paid.
Right.
And who is holding those jobs? So they start to intertwine of who is in those lower socioeconomic groups. And then you start, who is in prison more? That's a socioeconomic too, but why? And how does it start to cycle back on itself? So it's not that I don't know that you can say, well, that's socioeconomics and that's race.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's much more complex than
Well,
that.
you think
Yeah.
about, let's draw an analogy here. It's against the law for people, men or women, to be sexually harassed in our country. It's against the law. And yet it happens all the time.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't happen often with the cameras going. It happens, in an office with the door closed, or, something like that. My point is this, is that some of the things that black people experience are against the law. It's against the law for people to receive preferential treatment, to be, and so when they happen, how do you prove it? Because really it's someone's testimony. This is the way I was treated. And yet it happens so much. We hear so many stories. I hear so many stories from people I've known and I trust, that as a white person, it makes me say, there's something here. And am I going to have empathy to hear and care about what I'm hearing about their reality and their stories? It's hard to prove because people won't do it often. That's why George Floyd was such a big deal. It happened with the cameras rolling. So it's, to me, a lot of it is, am I going to have empathy and listen? There's a verse that I like. It says in Philippians 2:4, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. As a Christian, am I going to hear people's pain and care about it? And am I going to have empathy? Because this isn't a matter of what can I prove, it's a matter of can I listen to people's stories and care about their lives and their pain. For example, Mimi, you have 2 sons. Have you had to talk with them about if they get pulled over?
Oh, my word. Oh, every time they want to go somewhere. And that conversation started with, they were in elementary school with Trayvon Martin's death.
Yeah.
And then again with Tamir Rice's death. And with Trayvon Martin, it started with the vigilantism.
Yeah.
And, that's when my husband was like, oh, don't wear your hoodies outside. And,
My
take
son
those
wears
off.
lots of hoodies.
Right. But for young black boys, and that's when we said, with Tamir Rice, it was like no more water guns outside, no more of those those
Little pellet
spongy
guns.
pelt guns, outside. You stay inside with them. No more of those things. And they're like, but why? But why? And we had to explain to them. I don't remember if I showed them the video. I think I didn't want to succumb to them to that video with Tamir Rice because that just broke every part of my heart. Because my
It's
boys,
devastating.
It was devastating. That little boy didn't have a
little boy,
chance.
yeah.
Whereas if I think if that Tamir Rice were a white kid,
Oh,
that would have not happened.
It would have been different.
That kid would have been alive today.
yep.
And if it did,
Oh
there
my
would have been
word.
very different reactions.
Yes.
Very different reactions.
Oh, the cops need to be trained. There needs to be reform. And we hear about that right now with with the privilege some of the white cops have, or with justifying the statement "I feared for my life," and then shooting unarmed innocent black people. So I can't get into that because I'm not emotionally equipped to discuss that right now. But it has been a conversation. My boys are tired of hearing me, and my husband run down the list of what they, how they're supposed to speak, act. Now that they have their driving permits, that's a whole other issue. That one freaked me out. Even with me in the car with them driving, and my oldest is driving, and I'm like, well, here's what you have to do. Don't sit with your seat leaned all the way back. Our car windows aren't tinted. That's another issue. Don't play your music loud. You can hear the bass coming out the car. Turn it down, and don't drive too fast. Drive the speed limit. So it's all of these things that just white people don't have to think about.
Really?
Driving down the street or even walking down the street with a hoodie on, going to the corner store
At night.
at night.
Doesn't matter.
That's our reality.
I've never, the idea of having that a talk with my son if he gets pulled over. I've never even actually thought about having that, and I say that with sadness. And I'm acknowledging a privilege.
It's a privilege, yeah.
And I grieve that my black brothers and sisters have to deal with that
Right.
reality. When Ahmaud Arbery, when that situation happened, right after that, my son got on his longboard and took off in the neighborhood, and I watched him go away, and I thought, I'm not worried that he's not going to come back.
Exactly.
And that's so. It to me it raises the question: am I willing to ask my black brothers and sisters, what is it like for you? And am I willing to have empathy and listen to what it's like? Because if we argue about it, that will go just around and around and around. To me, it's an issue of empathy. Am I willing to listen to people that I know and trust? Am I willing to listen to their story and hear their pain?
Yeah.
What is it? Let's think about this for a minute. I've read articles about every NBA team has a 6'10" white guy who can shoot a little bit but is really slow, and they bring him in for the mop-up time. Every NBA team has that guy. And I've read articles or books where they talk about what it's like being on an NBA team, where sometimes they're the only white guy on the team, and what it experienced for them, and then they feel, a little left out or whatever, because that is an opportunity for them to see, oh, so this is what it's like.
Well, sometimes it's okay to be the oddball.
Sure.
Especially if you're a majority person. I've been the oddball many, 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 many times.
Right.
And I've had to adjust my behavior or to fit in to make people feel comfortable.
Right.
And that's just the reality of it. I talk to Colette all the time, about stuff that I would never or would caution myself speaking to other people about just because of their receptive lens on hearing and, like she said, listening to those things. There are things that Colette knows that I don't know that I've learned, especially about socioeconomic issues and how those affect communities on a whole, But I think it's important, especially as Christians, when we feel like we're the oddball in a certain situation, I don't care what color you are, to pay attention, to listen to each other, to ask questions, because you have to learn to be vulnerable when you don't know. And instead of saying, like, I've talked to someone before about crime, and then instead of her listening about, how crime affects minority people in cities and versus suburban, her response was, well, what about black on black crime? Like, that negates everything else, black on black crime, so you can't talk about any other types of crime, because black on black crime is the worst crime of all, and it was her privilege to say that, because she didn't understand.
Right.
Correct. You're defining that, exactly. You're defining that, for me, what that means from her lens, rather than listening and understanding. And then my response was, what about white on white crime? What about Latino on Latino crime? What kind of question is that? So I think we need to be patient and listen and understand other people's reality.
I agree 100%, and I laugh when people say that, right?
Yeah.
And Bill, the reason why you don't have to worry about your son, majority of because of the privilege that you have, right? And I have a friend that's in the NYPD. I'm from New York, and he tells me what his captain would say. He goes, "You know who to look out for," right? So that statement in itself is just black people, right? So that right there, it's boom. That's the privilege that you have, because you don't your son is not targeted, right? Your son, I'm not even putting him in. I like your son, DJ. That's my guy. Let's say a white kid could shoot up a church, could shoot up a school, could shoot up a movie theater, and be placed in handcuffs.
Yes.
And get snacks or burgers, whatever the case might be, right?
Water. Whatever.
And if a black kid is pulled over or a black woman is pulled over, they're dead.
Yep.
That's the privilege of being white. You were given this gift, right? To not worry about certain things because you're not being targeted.
You're talking about Sandra Bland.
Sandra Bland, yeah, I'm talking about all the things that have been happening with, like, these people, like, they could play this insane card, or this person is dealing with X, Y, Z, but if it's a black person, they're a thug, they're this, they're that, they're gangsters, they're whatever the case might be. That's what it is to have that privilege, and not even know about it. Like, why is it so? Like, you get pulled over, if I'm black, there's a high possibility that you're gonna die, right? But if you're white, you shoot up a school, you're gonna be taken to handcuffs and
peacefully detained.
Right.
Yeah.
So these are the things that white privilege give. Like, white privilege gives the fact that you could tell Jesus is white to the whole world and they believe it till this day. I had to learn that when I was in college, that this man was not white. I was like, wait, what? And I'm in church, in a Caribbean church with a white Jesus on the wall.
That's true. Absolutely true.
That's the privilege, So I think my mom thinks Jesus is white. Like, mom, that's these are the things that it's one of those things, like, that you have that gift to not worry or think or be targeted or have that.
Aaron Jones said something about white privilege that I thought was really helped me to understand what it is, because she said it's not necessarily about always whites taking something away from blacks. She said it's that as a white person, you don't have to think about race. She says, as a black person, I have to think about it every single day.
Yep.
Whereas I go through the day and it doesn't even come to my mind unless I have a conversation with someone else. And so I think to me that was a very important concept. Is that because, like you said, Hans, there's a high probability of people being killed. It's definitely a threat and a danger.
Right.
And yet, if you look at the actual statistics, it happens, but it doesn't happen all the time. But the fact that it does happen, when I get pulled over, I don't even think about that. But a black person has to think about that.
Right.
What is this encounter with law enforcement going to be like? And so that idea of not having to think about it.
Well, even just to call the police, you have to think about it, and I don't. In the Sandpoint area, she was the mom with a baby. She was pregnant and she had a toddler.
Yes.
And there was a break-in in her home, and I know I would have something in my hand if I thought someone's breaking into my home. I would have a baseball bat. I'd have a lamp. I'd have anything in my hand. I'm not
Right.
just going to stand there.
Right.
So when the police came, they shot her
Yeah.
and killed her, and her little girl is now in foster care.
Yeah, that's tragic.
So
oh,
I don't know what is an appropriate reaction for her to have been doing, what would have been appropriate behavior.
Right.
But it seemed like it was. And when somebody shares with you that that's a hurtful thing, it's just respectful not to counter that.
Right.
And
Exactly.
somebody has to make themselves vulnerable to you to share that experience with you. So are we safe to be shared with? Or are we just going to say, no, this is really the problem? I mean, that's just
yeah.
sorry, that's just insane.
You're right. That was a very good example. And especially as Christians in the space that we dwell in,
Yeah.
are we making ourselves vulnerable? Or allowing others to share with us their pain without retribution or, without pointing fingers and saying you're wrong just because it's not your reality.
And can I make myself vulnerable to say, you're right?
Right.
You're right. There's and I probably inadvertently I don't know, have been part of it because, like you say, it's just what is there.
Right.
We don't have to think about it. So I probably have been part of something or thought something that is part of the problem. So can I make myself vulnerable back to say, let's put this out on the table and let's have a conversation, and not just with the random coworker. I'm going to throw that out too, not the random person in the grocery store to say, hey, why do black people do this?
Random people,
or expect that a coworker is going to make themselves vulnerable with you when you
Right. haven't
proven yourself.
Correct. Your
Because
intentions.
I've had those come back at me too, saying, well, no, I asked my coworker and he said, no, they have they can make it on their own if they wanted to, and that's not the problem. I'm like, oh, wow, I'm sure they were really honest with you and straightforward because we know what your attitude is already, and you're not a safe person to really share that with. So we need to be cognizant of what it takes to even share things.
I want to circle back, Hans, to something you said because I want to make sure I understand. You talked about the oppressor. As a white person, when I hear that, I think, okay, I'm not consciously oppressing anybody. Help me understand what you mean by that.
Oh, okay. So, in the sense of, especially systematically, right?
So you're not necessarily talking about individuals.
It can be individual.
It can be.
If you are trying to oppress a certain
Right,
group, right?
right.
You will be the oppressor.
Okay.
However, systematically, it's built for a system that is built for one group to benefit over another group. That itself, it's oppression, So that's what I mean by that. I'm not saying all white people are oppressing people. No, that's not what I'm saying. But the system itself is built that way, so it benefits white people more than it benefits other people, people of color. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's focus on something practical. What can we do
Oh, that's a good question.
within our context? How can we clean up the garbage on our side of the street, in my community, in my sphere? Because I can't change the world always, but I can do what I can in my sphere. So what can we do to the disadvantages that black people experience as a white person. What can I do to be of help? Not being a white savior, I don't believe in that, but to be an advocate for justice, to be a positive force in this issue. What are things that we can do? Because we can lament the world is broken, but what can we do to be a blessing in our sphere?
Okay, so since we're cleaning things up, I'm sorry, Mom. My mom doesn't think Jesus is white, but she's gonna kill me. But
I want to meet your mom. She sounds awesome.
She's a beautiful queen. But that's a great question, and I have a story that goes with it, and I'll be short. One of my friends, we was having a birthday party. She just turned 78. She's an amazing woman, so powerful. And she was telling the story. It was like a questionnaire, if you know her. It's A, B, C, whatever. And she was telling the story. She's like, have I ever been pulled over? What did I do? Did I run from the police? Did I do this, X, Y, and Z? And the question was, she was getting into a cop car, behind the cop car, and she ran from the police. And thank God, she got away, and everything was good, right? One of her white friends, because she's a white woman, and one of her white friends said, hey, that shows your privilege telling that story, because if you were black, it would not have happened that way, right? Yeah. So holding other white people accountable would be the best thing to do to further that, to clean up the street, your street, right? If you realize, hey, what you just did there, or that right there showed your white privilege, and you talk to another white person about that, and they could be like, oh, wow, you're right. And my friend, she called me. She goes, hey, I just wanted to tell you this is what we discussed. And I was like, oh, I didn't take it any kind of way because I know you, right? I wouldn't say that story to HBCU. Yeah. I wouldn't go, you know what I mean? But because I know you, I know your heart, and it's fine. Like, I didn't take it like you were showing your privilege. No, it was a funny story, and I want to know more about it. But holding other white people accountable would help that. And I think that was beautiful that her friend did that, and she has friends that are well aware of her privilege as well.
Okay, thanks, Hans. Anybody else? What can we do in our sphere of influence?
I'll go quick. I think there's two things, and I think the first thing is for white people to understand. Yes, white privilege exists. You may not believe so, but I think it's important to understand how history has evolved into where we are now, and to understand how our Constitution, just understand some history. Even though we've read things and skimmed over things in our history books, they didn't go in depth until how the structures, our Constitution was created to oppress people. And a very good article I read, and I'm going to recommend it to everyone who's listening, watching, especially white people. It's called Understanding White Privilege. It's by Francis Kendall. It was written in 2002. However, it is still very relevant. The statements made in here, there are a lot of historical, for those of you who like facts and history, this is a little bit more academic, but it's very plain and clear about what white privilege is and how our systems of government have structured white privilege. And this goes way back to our founding fathers and how that still affects us today. So that's what I would suggest, number one, is for you to understand some history and how the history has helped form where we are today in terms of race relations. The second one I wanted to state very quickly on how we can learn to clean up the street on our side is to know your story personally, and how, especially as a Christian, how you want to portray yourself as a Christian, a white Christian, black Christian, to those who are coming to you to be vulnerable. How are you listening to those people? How are you receiving them? And what you are holding yourself accountable for? And how are you expecting that same from yourself and the people around you? That's very critical in learning how to clean up the street.
and I concur with all of that. I will add that, like Mimi mentioned, that when you go into a room, you look around the room and you are aware of who is there, and I think we need to do that too. When you walk into a room, who is there and who is not there?
Absolutely.
And why aren't they there? Have they been invited to the room? And if they are in the room, do they have a place at the table in the room? Being in the room is not enough. Not even sitting at the table is enough. Are they able to share in the decision making of that space? Because we have people there. Some spaces have at least got people in the room, but are they actually allowed to influence the decisions and what happens in that room? Or are they just there and will listen to your opinion, but then we'll go make the decision? It needs to be a shared power and shared decision making for things to really happen. We need those perspectives. We need the diversity of perspectives. There is not one race, not one language, not one gender, whatever you want to go into that can represent Christ. He spans way beyond any of that. And so in order for us to represent Christ in our communities, we need the diversity, we need the thought process that everybody brings to be able to connect to different people and to be able to show him. We bear his likeness, you bear his likeness, everybody bears his likeness. So if we are missing someone in that room, we are missing a piece of Christ.
Amen. Absolutely right. I agree.
Yeah. Hans, you and I were part of a group of white pastors and black pastors who sat and had a conversation. And there was one of the white pastors there. Remember the tall redhead guy? And we had just an honest talk about what life was like and what our different experiences were. And I will never forget what he said. He said, I thought I was in the wrong place being part of this group. He said, I don't have any racial animosity. It wasn't my issue, not my problem. But when he heard his black brothers saying what their experience was, he said, all of a sudden I realized it is my problem because I'm part of the body of Christ. I'm part of the church, and I need to be a voice for justice and unity and love. So as far as what we can do, I think one of the biggest things is listen to people's stories and have an open heart. Like the verse that is our compass heading for the podcast, 2 Corinthians 7:2, make room for us in your hearts.
Yep.
That's what he did by listening, and it opened his mind to some things he hadn't thought about. I talked to a college professor friend of mine, a white woman, last night, and she said that a lot of her students are minorities. And she says, in her experience with them, if she sees a minority pulled over, she will just pull over and bear witness.
Yep.
She's not saying police are all bad. That's one thing she does to extend her privilege to other people, to help other people. She's there as a witness.
Nice.
And those are examples. One thing that I have done is I heard about a situation where there was a young teenage black boy who was roughly handled, in the sense he was out of the car at gunpoint. He wasn't armed. He was made to lay on the ground, whatever. I just simply reached out to the sheriff, said identified myself as a pastor, and said, this is what I heard. I said, I'm not claiming I know the whole story. I'm just concerned. And it triggered an investigation. I think one of the things we can do is try to just be an advocate for people.
Right.
To care about their experience. It doesn't mean you don't have to agree. To me, it comes down to, do you care? And is your heart open? Because there's going to be a lot of things we don't agree on, but we can move incrementally towards each other if we care.
Right.
And if we realize a rising tide lifts all boats. And so if the privilege and the respect, that's one thing I think when I think of white privilege, I think of the suspicion that my black friends tell me about, followed in stores, or the coldness of where they're served last, or things like that. If we can do what we can to be an advocate for other people, a rising tide lifts all boats, and it makes everybody better off. Thank you, Colette, for being with us today.
You're welcome.
And Hans and Mimi, it's good to have you back.
Yes.
You had to be
Good to be back.
quarantined for our last episode, so glad you're well and glad that that you're back. And thank you for being with us. 2 Corinthians 7:2, make room for us in your hearts. Let's listen to each other and let's make our world a better place and clean up the garbage on our side of the street. And let's keep reading and studying to learn and understand. Thank you for being with us today.